How's it going, guys, and welcome to the SYNTHO app. If you're someone who struggles to get their bass sounding good in their tracks, or just trying to give their bass an extra bit of oomph than it needs, then keep watching, because today I'm going to be giving you my top 5 tips for better sounding bass. Let's get stuck in. So my first tip for better sounding bass in your tracks is going to be looking at the harmonics within your bass. So I have here a sub bass. And if you're listening on a phone or small speakers, you're probably not going to be able to hear that because it's just a sine wave. If we have a look at this on an EQ, you'll see there's not many harmonics going on there. There's only the kind of fundamental frequency. And this is the only frequency we're really looking at. Now, the key to having a good sounding sub bass is, whilst we can use a sine wave, is we need to use something with more harmonics in it. So more harmonics means that you're going to hear more mid-tone, because the more harmonics you have in your bass tone, the more likely you are to hear it on the smaller systems. So I'm going to show you a comparison of another bass, more harmonics in, and you'll be able to hear the difference straight away. So I have this bass here. And you can hear that's got that mid-tone in it. So if we have a look at the frequencies being present for this, you can see all those extra frequencies being present. And really, this is the key to having a sub bass sound good on a smaller system. Sometimes you've seen those rave videos as well, and you're watching them back, and suddenly there's a big drop and everyone's going wild, but at the same time all you're hearing are drums, and that's because there are not enough harmonics to be heard on a small speaker such as your phone. So there are 2 fundamental ways of getting those harmonics added to our sub bass. The first thing we're going to be looking at is by starting off with a buzzy tone. In any case, I'm using Subboom Bass, but you can use any other VST or plugin you want to for this. So if I take off the filter, you'll be able to hear there's a really buzzy sound. And because it's a more complex wave shape than a sine, it means it's got those extra harmonic frequencies added. You can see here all those extra harmonics to play with. So we're actually going to be doing subtractive synthesis here, where we're going to be taking away frequencies. It's a bit like starting with a big block of marble and then chipping away to create the statue at the end. So by starting off with a more complex wave shape and a more complex tone, you'll be able to take away some of the harshness and buzzinesses that we don't want and be left with that nice warm sub with lots of harmonics to play with. So we're going to filter out all of those harmonics. Now I'm using the Subboom Bass filter, but you can use an EQ just the same. And again, we're just trying to create that warm tone without any of those harsh top end frequencies. Now, while this is sounding good, another great way of adding harmonic frequencies is going to be using saturation. So we're going to use the Ableton saturator, and we can just drag this in. And then we're going to increase the drive by, let's call it, say, 7 dB. And then we're going to reduce the output by 7 dB. That way, we're not getting a change in volume, but simply a change in tone. Saturation actually comes from an old school engineering technique where they would add lots of gain to a signal and then pull the volume down really low. By adding more gain, you're applying more voltage to the signal, which means that the transistors and circuitry inside that mixing desk were being added to that signal. This added those warm harmonic frequencies that we wanted to hear. Because you're adding lots of gain, it made it a lot louder. So they pulled the faders down really low. So it's keeping the same volume, but just changing the tone. It adds this warm distortion that sounds really nice. We're replicating that same technique using the saturator by increasing the drive and then turning the output gain down. You can change the style of saturation as well. So maybe a medium curve. And that's a lot more of a harsher version. So it's up to you to do it to taste, but these are 2 great techniques to add those harmonic frequencies that you can have your sub bass sounding good on any system. So for my second tip, we're going to be layering our bass to create a more complex tone. By layering two sounds together, it gives us more control on the overall sound, allowing you to mix the sub and top layer together to mix it exactly how you need it in your track. Rather than having one sound dedicated for the bass, by layering two, you can create more unique sounds that are suited for your track. So in this context, all I'm doing is duplicating the original signal from this sub bass, and then I'm choosing the top layer to layer in with that sub bass. I'm using this 303 here, and instantly you can hear it creates a more complex tone. So without it, and with it, and this is a great way to get that more unique tone in your bass sounds. There are a few things you need to do in order to layer them correctly though. So because I have a sound dedicated to the low end, this sub, you need to make sure that you're EQing your top layer so that there's no bass present. Bass frequencies are going to clash and they're going to create muddiness and cause problems within your track. So I'm going to head over to our top layer, and you can see here I've EQ'd out all frequencies below 147 Hertz. This is to make sure there's no clashing low end and that sub bass can come through. What's great about using a top layer is that now I can make it more complex and create it exactly how I need it for the track. So I'm going to add some chorus, gives it some nice width and a little bit of extra tone. And this is something I wouldn't be able to do if I was processing it as a single sound, because you don't want to be adding chorus to a sub bass because that's going to create it wide and it's going to create some phasing issues. So another thing I'm doing is I've got this kickstart, is just to sidechain it so it moves nicely alongside the bass. And another thing I could do is potentially add some delays and reverbs to this. However, you need to be careful when you're adding these types of processing to your bass layers. At the end of the day, you're still working with low registering sounds. And when you're adding reverbs and delays, this can cause a lot of rumble and muddy frequencies to your mix. I'll show you an example. So if I were to add a ping pong delay, and whilst there's nothing wrong with this, first of all, that delay is making the bass have too much space and it sounds like it's too far away. And second of all, that can create a lot of muddiness in the track. So you can hear that those clashing delays are really sort of not sounding very nice. So it's good to sometimes have maybe some very subtle delay or reverb on that top layer, but please use it sparingly because it can create problems in your mix and you want things to come through nice and cleanly. And generally speaking, I like to treat my top layer in the same way as I treat my bass and keep the processing nice and minimalistic. Now I've obviously used this acid sound, but you can use anything from an organ to a pad to a pluck. It's really up to you. And this is where you can be nice and creative by creating your own top layers that can be unique to your track. So for my third tip, we're going to be having a look at the processing you need to have on your bass without fail. So one of the main things we're going to be looking at is going to be side chaining. And this is essential when you want your bass to be sounding tight with your kick drums. So there are two great plugins we can use for this. One is we can use a compressor. And the second, we can use a LFO tool, such as Kickstart, which is a great fail-safe for having a nice tight sidechain with your kick. Kickstart is super cheap as well, so it'd be worth the investment, but don't worry, we can use Ableton plugins to do our side chaining. Now, this is a really commonly known technique, and the reason why I'm mentioning it is because sometimes it's really overlooked at the same time. And whilst you may be adding side chaining to your bass, a lot of the time people aren't actually adding enough. So I'm going to add the compressor, and if you didn't know, there's this little drop down arrow here, and then we can turn on the sidechain button. Now we can select audio from, and then we're going to select the channel, which is the kick. And then now we have our bass sidechain to our kick. But one thing people seem to neglect is how much sidechaining to have. So you need to really have an audible dip in the bass in order to have proper sidechaining. So I'm going to pull this right the way down, and you can hear now it's starting to actually pump in time with the kick. Because a lot of people only have a small amount of gain reduction, and they think that's enough. And that means that often then the bass will be clashing with a kick. And so even though you've got sub sidechaining on there, you've not got enough. So the two controls you really want to be having a look at are the threshold and then the ratio. So the ratio is how much compression will be added. So in simple terms, the ratio is how much compression will be added. So a higher ratio means it'll be compressed more. And then the threshold, it'll be where it starts compressing at. So the lower the threshold, the more the signal gets compressed. A faster attack will also mean that it compresses in time with the kick drum. So now you can hear that's got that audible pump, which means that that's sidechained properly with our kick drum. The next thing we need to do for processing our bass is also adding a utility. Ableton's utility is a great tool to have because it has the bass mono feature. Now, if you've got a dedicated sub bass, you can simply turn your whole channel mono and that's job done. But if you've got one tone for your bass, then it actually has this bass mono feature. And this means that all frequencies below what we set it to, so 120 Hertz, will be turned into mono. This is to stop stereo bass frequencies from clashing with each other and cancelling each other out. Sometimes it's good to play with the width of the sound as well, because you don't want to have too much width on your bass tone. So if you are using a single tone, have a play with the width and try and find that sweet spot. Just make sure you've got the sub frequencies set to mono. So if you're not sure, head to your audio effects, go to utilities, and then you'll see the utility. You can drag that in and then turn on mono, or you can turn the bass mono. So my fourth tip is for when you want to add that extra bit of oomph to your bass, but you don't want to play around with the frequencies too much. Sometimes you have that really nice warm sub, but it doesn't sound fat enough and it needs that extra kick to really punch through. So I'm going to show you a technique called parallel compression to help give those sub frequencies that extra kick that you need in your track. So quickly, I'll show you what it sounds like and then we can show you how to set it up yourself. If I have this just with a kick and bass, and then if I send it to the compression, you'll hear those sub-frequencies are really being exaggerated. Now, obviously I went to an extreme extent so you could hear it. You don't normally want to add that much, but it's a great way of being able to mix a heavily compressed signal with the dry signal. So to set this up, all you need to do is create a new return channel. Then you're going to want to add a compressor and then an EQ afterwards. The first thing you want to do is making sure that the EQ is removing all frequencies above around 150 Hertz. This means that any signal that is sent to this return channel is only focusing on the bass frequencies. So we're going to pull this down to about 150. Then on the compressor, what we need to do is have an extremely high ratio, a low threshold, and a more bendy knee. So we're going to increase the ratio to about 5:1. A much higher ratio again will mean that it's going to be compressed a lot more. We're then going to pull the threshold down low to about -25. This means that it's going to be activated through a larger portion of the signal. Finally, we're just going to change the knee from 6 dB to 12 because a more bendy knee is better suited for bass frequencies. And there you have your parallel compression chain set up and ready to be used. So now if I start to send my sub bass to this, you'll see it's starting to compress this version of the signal. And I can mix in a heavily compressed version of the signal with the original, allowing me to give my low end just that extra bit of oomph that it needs. Especially when you're creating your own sounds, sometimes the sub frequencies can be the ones that are lacking. So this is a great technique just to give that extra bit of oomph without changing the tone of the bass you originally have. Using an EQ and simply boosting the bass frequencies can sometimes get a bit messy and cause unnecessary muddiness. So this is a great technique to really give your bass some extra low end without compromising the quality of the sound that you already have. So my final tip for better sounding bass is going to be looking at the automation. Now this is actually a really neglected part that I often hear in tracks. And this is because people have neglected their automation for their bass. They've got these nice complex sounding synths and great effects, but the bass often sounds very flat. It doesn't actually evolve or move within the track. So we're going to have a quick look at how we can elevate our bass using automation. So the most common parameter we can automate is going to be the filter cutoff. This is a really commonly used one, and it's a great way to add a bit of extra movement with your bass tone, especially when you've got more than just a simple sub bass and you've got something such as a pluck bass or an acid style bass. Automating the cutoff is a great way to give that extra variety to your sound. So we can have a look at the filter cutoff for this bass layer. So instantly we can move this cutoff around. So let's start to add a bit of automation. And a great thing we can do is by starting off really low and then building up and then coming back low again. So at the start of every bar or phrase, it's a good place to have it nice and low. And then we can build it back up again, pull it back down and move on from here. If you wanted to record it in yourself, move it manually. All you have to do is make sure that no track is armed, making sure this automation button here is turned on. And then by pressing the record button and then moving the parameter you want, you can record in your automation manually. And it goes on from there. And you can see by having that automation, it will mean that the bass line is a lot less flat and a lot less static. One of the keys to creating a lot of impact within your tracks is by trying to create contrast. And one of the easiest ways to do that is by creating contrast with the automation. So from going from a really open sound to then a closed sound, you can create a nice amount of impact and contrast. And that's going to sound great for your listeners to keep them engaged and really have those impact moments, such as your drops. This is then also linking back to one of our previous tips on why we should layer our basses, because when we do that, we've got a lot more parameters to play with, allowing us to add more movement and variety within our bass sounds. So I can show you an example of what I mean. So I have here a section where we're about to go into a change. So just before most of the main percussion is going to come in. So I'm going to pull this up really high and you'll hear this contrast makes a lot bigger impact than if we didn't have it. And then if you just listen without it, it sounds a lot more flat. And this is one of the reasons why automation is so crucial for adding that extra bit of movement and variety for your listeners to latch onto for your bass sounds. So hopefully you found these tips useful, and there's going to be something in here to help elevate your bass lines to really make your tracks pop on the dance floor. And if you've got any questions, or if there's a new video you want to hear from me, then make sure you drop me a comment below. I'll see you on the next video.